Good evening to Have I Got News for Jews? Lovely to see you tonight. So welcome to the latest in our series of BoDCast seminars, which are addressing areas of interest and concern to the whole community. This week, we are focusing on the media. The media plays an increasing role in everyone's life, with 24-hour coverage of national and world events. News these days is much more than opening your paper on a Friday morning. The coverage of our world and our community has become ever more a part of our lives since we went online. So how is the Jewish community perceived and represented in the national and international media? I'm delighted to say that we have a very distinguished panel here tonight who are ready to discuss these issues and answer any questions that you may have for them. We're very grateful that they've managed to join us at such a very busy time. I'm now going to pass you over to our host for the evening, the Board of Deputies Chief Executive, Gillian Maron, who will now introduce our guests and chair the discussion. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Marie, for that warm welcome to everybody, which I echo. And I am delighted to be at our latest BoDCast, which is the fourth in a new Board of Deputies series of online webinars for the Jewish community, where we're addressing lively and current key issues. Now, as we know, there is an old saying that Jews are news. And we are a small community, but we do seem to be endlessly fascinating to the media. But let's find out tonight whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and how well and how fairly or otherwise the media covers the Jewish world. So tonight we are delighted to be joined by three eminent journalists who are going to offer real insight into this subject. Our three panelists are Jessica Elgot, who is Chief Political Correspondent of The Guardian, Richard Ferrer, who is Editor of the Jewish News, and Paul Harris, who is Editor of the Jewish Telegraph. You're all very welcome, and we're all very grateful to you. So this is how it's going to run. I'm going to begin by asking our panelists to tell us a bit about their background and their work, and invite them to choose what they feel is the biggest challenge facing the media in covering our community. There will, of course, be time for questions from the audience who are watching live on social media, so do submit comments and questions throughout, and we will feature some of them during this podcast. So I'm going to start with Jessica. Jessica, could you tell us about your background in journalism and the biggest challenge for you and your colleagues in the media in covering Jewish issues? Over to you.
Hi everyone. So I grew up in Leeds. Well, I grew up in Harrogate, but my sort of Jewish community was in Leeds, and then went to university in Nottingham, and later did a master's in journalism in Cardiff. I think I've wanted to be a journalist since I was really small. I once made a magazine, I think I was about 9, called Small Kids Big Ideas, which I produced at the expense of my father's colour printer. So it's been a long held ambition, and I after doing some work experience at the Jewish Chronicle, that was my first gig in journalism. I worked there for 3 years, and I have to say that, like, even though we were breaking some pretty big stories at the JC, it doesn't feel like when I was there you could have the kind of same national impact now. There wasn't the similar kind of scandal around the Labour Party that there was over recent years. My work there tended to cover important things like the new chief rabbi, but sort of less things of a similar scale and national importance. And from there I went to the Huffington Post, which was sort of a new launch in the UK when I went there, and I was eventually one of the news editors there, and then I moved to the Guardian as a general news reporter, and finally over to the politics team. And my first day in the politics team was in June 2016, so the day after the EU referendum. So I'd say that my entire time in political journalism has basically been dominated by Brexit, and I've only just come back off maternity leave, so it's quite strange to come back and not have the news cycle completely dominated by Brexit, although we have had had a little bit of a revival of that recently.
That's great, Jessica. Is there a particular issue you wanted to highlight that you think?
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of in my day-to-day job, I'm very rarely covering exclusively Jewish issues, but the obvious one is the sort of long running crisis in the Labour Party over anti-Semitism, and something that was addressed by Keir Starmer in his speech today as well. And generally, I think that I encountered a kind of double-edged problem there, a literacy generally in the general public about Judaism, and particularly the relationship with Israel, and also, particularly the meaning of the term Zionism. I actually don't think, if you're working for a mainstream newspaper, that's a useful term to ever use yourself in copy, just because there's so much misunderstanding or different interpretations even from both sides about what that term means. And also, it was as someone who knows quite a lot about the Labour Party and reported the Labour Party for a long time, there was also a kind of dual difficulty explaining the traditions of the Labour Party to people I met in the Jewish community as well. So there were obviously systems in place in the Labour Party that were just not fit to deal with such a scale of such a crisis that they encountered, and that was something that led to quite a lot of misunderstandings early on. So it has generally been a challenging story to cover.
And we're going to come back both to the issue of Israel and also Labour anti-Semitism in a short while. So we'll look forward to hearing more from you about that. So thank you very much. And I'm now going to turn to Richard to tell us a bit about himself, his career, and also what he thinks the greatest challenges for us.
Hi, Gillian. Thank you, Marie. Hello, good evening, everyone. Lovely to be here. So I'm Richard Ferrer. I've had the privilege of editing the Jewish News now for 11 years. Before that, I got rejected for a job at Small Kids Big Ideas. Jessica, so I'm a bit annoyed at you on that one. I don't know what it was about my application, but fair enough. No, I started in 1995, before the internet, on magazines that are now in the great big magazine graveyard in the sky, places like FHM, Vox, Maxim. Then I did product development, working for a teenage boys lifestyle title. It always baffled me that girls had Ms. and Sugar and Bliss and all these wonderful lifestyle titles for teenage girls, but boys just had football magazines. So I launched one of those. Then the internet came along. And I joined totallyjewish.com. Don't know if anyone remembers that. The .com boom, it was a big Jewish website at the time. Then I went to America and edited the Boston Jewish Advocate, went back to old media. Then I went to the Daily Mail. Then I worked for Murdoch for a very short-term title called the London Paper. And then 2009, the Jewish News came along. And it's been an absolute pleasure to edit a community newspaper and see it grow. We publish about 16,000 copies at the moment. Obviously, the pandemic has curtailed our distribution. We were publishing about 23,000 copies. A lot of schools and community centres where we're read are sadly closed and will remain closed in light of today's government announcement. In terms of my biggest challenge, I guess it's to get new audiences in an industry that's just got a myriad of shiny objects for people to spend their time on. Instagram, Snapchat, LinkedIn, TikTok, all those news and showbiz websites, The Guardian, of course. The Jewish News has plenty of shiny objects too, but convincing anyone under 30 that a product with the word Jewish in the title can be stimulating and rewarding for them is a high bar to climb. So I spend my days trying to figure out how we can engage younger people as well as retain that older audience that we value so highly.
Thanks very much, Richard. I had no idea that Small Kids Big Ideas was so formative in the lives of so many.
It was underfunded.
I'm sure. On that point, I shall turn to Paul and invite him to introduce himself. And did you ever get yourself anywhere near Small Kids, Big Ideas?
Not exactly. I've got a very unusual route into journalism, I suppose. I was brought up in a journalist's family. My parents founded the Jewish Telegraph 70 years ago this December in their dining room with a borrowed typewriter and £50 capital. So all I ever knew was the Jewish Telegraph. All my holidays, school holidays, were spent in the office, the printing works. I knew what I wanted to do all along. My parents wanted me to have a more conventional career, but journalism was always for me. In my school days, I ran a magazine, primary school, at the age of about 8 or 9. And again, as soon as I got into grammar school, I was helping with the school newspaper. And on leaving school, I joined a local newspaper group in Greater Manchester and trained there, and then joined the family business. Without giving too much of my age away, I've actually been with the Telegraph 50 years this year, which is a long time. I took over as editor from my late father in 1979. I was, at that time, the youngest editor in the country. And I was left with a legacy of union agreements with the print unions, who, of course, were the strongest union in the country, almost impossible agreements. And I had to fight the union. I had to fight my own staff in a closed shop who remembered me as a schoolboy in short trousers. And it was very difficult, particularly when we decided to become one of the first newspapers in the country to go photo typeset and introduce what was then new technology, which was very, very staunchly resisted by the print unions. And we had terrible battles with them ongoing, which we won when we refused to allow a closed shop. And I was told that the print unions would close us down rather than allow that. They would stop distribution of the paper. But we continued, and somehow we carried on. In my time as editor, I've managed to introduce separate editions for the Jewish Telegraph, as well as our traditional Manchester edition in Leeds, Liverpool and Glasgow, where we have offices and staff as well. And it is a challenge, particularly in those smaller communities. It's a huge challenge, particularly with the internet. We took a decision very, very early on not to give much of our content away on social media or on the internet, because we are a paid-for paper, and that has remained successful. We've received criticism for not updating or upgrading our website, but we continue to sell the paper, very fortunately. And even during these challenging COVID times, far from losing circulation, strangely enough, we've actually put it on. And we've actually received subscription requests from literally all over the place, from areas we never expected. And during this time, we also launched an e-edition behind a paywall, which attracted a lot of readers from out of town and from abroad. So what challenges did we face? I think one of the principal challenges my staff and I face is resisting pressure from Jewish organizations and Jewish individuals, particularly, not to publish items. We're threatened all the time that if we publish something, we'll be sued, or that advertising will be withdrawn. And we have to resist this all the time. Only last week, we were threatened by an organization that if we didn't guarantee them that they had the front page splash, the front page lead story, they would pull the wraparound that they had booked with us, which is an expensive thing and a lot of advertising revenue. They refused to release their artwork to us until we gave them the guarantee. We actually pulled their advertising, which I thought was pretty good in these times. We resisted the revenue and we stuck up for our rights there. And the other challenge I think we face is that the Jewish media does have to self-regulate in some way, even self-censor. There are certain stories we just cannot run, even though we would like to. And I refer particularly to stories relating to security. Very often we have identified for us security breaches within Jewish organizations. It would be totally irresponsible for us to run anything like this and to give terrorists any chance of succeeding in any sort of attack on an organization. So when I say self-censorship, these are the sort of things that we wouldn't run. It is very difficult, but I think we have to be responsible at times as well, knowing the community we serve.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, absolutely fascinating, because you've all come to your role in such different ways and have such different experiences and challenges. Yet I'm sure you all understand each other very much. So I want to turn first of all to the issue which has dominated so much of the media headlines in a way that we could never have dreamt of, which was anti-Semitism at the very heart of our political establishment. In other words, within the Labour Party, as it did for some years. And you'll all be very familiar with the role that the Board of Deputies took with other communal organisations in taking the fight direct to the then leadership on behalf of the community. And we were featured, of course, on many front pages, and it was a constant story and narrative. What I'd like to know about from each of you is, what was it like to be on the inside of the media and watching all that happen? We know what it was like on the outside to be reading and viewing, but we don't know how it felt for you. So I'm going to go first to Richard and then to Paul and Jessica. Richard.
Yes. Look, I mean, look, Ginny, I don't need to tell you. I recall when you had that first meeting with Jonathan Arkush. When was that? Back in 2016. You've probably still got the sore head from banging your head against the wall while you sat in a room with him. Look, when we look back on those ghastly 4.5 years, when a man beloved of Jew haters was poised to become Prime Minister, I think the community was in a sense of sheer panic. And look, I hold my head up as well. I hold my hand up as well. I feel that a lot of what we did during that time at the Jewish News was highly responsible and absolutely what we needed to do. But there was a sense that perhaps we overstepped the mark slightly in terms of hyperbole. But it was a very challenging time. Much has changed since in a short space of time. And I do want to look forward. All eyes are on EHRC now, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission report, which is now imminent. Much has changed since last December, when Corbyn led his party to the worst electoral accumulation since 1935. There is a new town, and Sakir has already turned the party upside down. So its backside is no longer in charge. Even today, and in his conference speech, which notably was introduced by Ruth Smith, he again mentioned the rooting out once and for all of anti-Semitism in the party. But yeah, I mean, if you look back on what we reported, some of it just makes your mind boggle. You know, members feeling absolutely entitled to tweet about Zionists ruling the world and then the next day standing to be a councillor. Internal reports about Jewish racism suddenly just disappearing from HQ. Incriminating files just suddenly evaporating. Disputes officers suffering nervous breakdowns, the reluctance to punish anti-Semitic members, a pressure group, Jewish Voice for Labour, being launched just to claim that anti-Semitism was being weaponized. There were times, of course, where I felt that we were being completely overwhelmed by what we were seeing. And yeah, even up to the final hours of that election night, it wasn't clear where we were going to go. And maybe we were going to be faced with somebody who was going to be leading this country that was, as I said, you know, the absolute pin-up for anti-Semites in this country. Luckily, that didn't happen. Luckily, there's little reason to doubt that Starmer will take the HRC findings very seriously, on the chin, when they come, and we can move forward. And who knows, maybe Labour will be a party for the Jewish community to vote for in 4 years' time.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'll now go to Paul to ask you, what was it like on the, within the Jewish Telegraph to be watching that story and covering it?
It was a very unusual time, as Richard will recall. So unique was it that the Jewish News, the Jewish Telegraph and the Jewish Chronicle rivals got together and ran the identical front page headline, same front page comment piece, same graphic. calling out Labour and calling the Labour Party and Corbyn an existential threat to the Jewish community. This was unique in itself, not just in British journalism, but in world journalism for any newspapers to do that. The climate changed dramatically. What we saw was that people were approaching us and saying, well, if the leader of the opposition is saying this, members of the shadow cabinet are saying this, councillors are saying this, leading members of the party are saying there must be something in it. You Jews must have something to answer for. And it was very, very difficult, always reflecting, as Richard said, not too much hyperbole, but I think we also indulge in it. But editorially, in our editorial conferences, we wondered whether we were overdoing it, because week after week after week, we were leading the front page on Labour, one misdemeanor after another. All our columnists were writing about it. The leader column was writing about it. So the paper was full of it. And we were aware that we might actually bore the pants off our readers, but we felt we had to warn even Jewish people, because a lot of Jewish people were actually being taken in by this and wondering if there was something wrong with their own community. A year before Corbyn finally fell, I was doing television and radio interviews and constantly being asked by interviewers whether it was true that Jewish people were preparing to leave the country, they were looking to emigrate. And at that time I was saying, no, this is all exaggerated. The climate changed very much in the final 12 months, and suddenly our correspondence columns were full of comments from readers saying they were petrified and they were actually considering going on Aliyah, traveling anywhere, getting out of the country. They were actually fearful of remaining in Britain. And it was very, very noticeable the way things changed. Within our office, we had constant debates about how to handle this, who to speak to. Richard will also recall that he and I were interviewed by Chakrabarti for her infamous report. We were called to a plush London restaurant, interviewed in a back room there, and she made all sorts of promises at the time about the fact that our comments would be taken seriously and that their leader would be called out if necessary in the report, and nothing of the sort when it appeared. I think most of what we said was ignored. So yes, it was a very, very difficult and unusual time.
I think we're in a real sense of the tension that you were all working under. Obviously, it was a very tense time for the community and certainly within the Board of Deputies, but I feel you're sort of highlighting how it was from a media point of view. So I'll turn now to Jessica. What was it like in your world during that time?
I think that it's a difficult thing to navigate as a political correspondent, and particularly working for The Guardian, where I'd say particularly the 2017 Labour manifesto was exactly the sort of thing that our readers are keen on. It promised lots of really bold economic policies that you'd expect a kind of centre-left paper to support, and yet there was always this very difficult problem with Corbyn and his previous associates that kept creeping back into the news cycle. For me, I feel like when it really kicked off in the mainstream media was the mural, which was something that anyone, and the intervention by Luciana Berger, and eventually the calling of the Enough is Enough demo, which I think really, that was the first time I think it probably penetrated into the mainstream consciousness about how difficult some of these associations that Corbyn had made as a backbench MP were, and brought and shed new light on some of the stuff he'd done and the associations he'd made there. I felt, in terms of covering it, that it was that as a national newspaper, it's difficult to get sucked into every single incident, and as you both described, there were so many from so many members and so many councillors who were being singled out for comments they'd made on social media, which were atrocious, and therefore, how do you kind of push that? How do you push that story along in a national sense? And for me, I felt the best way to approach it was to try to report on how the party was tackling the issue and the internal battles within the party to address what was clearly a massive problem, the battles on the NEC within the shadow cabinet, and particularly what comes to mind is the is the long fight over the IRA definition, where one by one, even people in Corbyn's very closest circle seem to be won over to adopting the whole definition, and yet that was delayed and delayed and delayed, and the internal party politics, I felt, was perhaps one of the most interesting and illuminating things to cover from a national perspective. And I still think that, you know, that's probably the best way to approach it reporting wise from now on as well, from the EHRC perspective as well. We want to see what how Starmer reacts to that report. We want to see if there's legal action on the basis of that report from people who may feel they've been unfairly wronged by that report. And there will be people around Jeremy Corbyn's close circle who feel they did try to do a lot about anti-Semitism, and that role will be ignored by this report. Maybe it won't, but you know, there are going to be people feeling aggrieved one way or the other after this report comes out, and that's something that's a kind of interesting reporting challenge that's coming up.
I mean, of course, you know, the story isn't all over, but we find ourselves in different circumstances. But it was a time that none of us will forget, that's for sure, for all the wrong reasons. I want to move on, actually, and Jessica mentioned this, but onto the issue of Israel. I mean, we often hear Israel's treated unfairly in the media. I just wanted to know what you thought about that. So what's your view on how Israel, the Middle East, boycotts, the whole issue around Israel is treated? So let me go to Paul first of all.
I think Israel gets very unfair coverage in the media very often. The national press seems to delight in often using stock photos to illustrate Israel, in inverted commas, atrocities. I think the bleeding heart Palestinians always make good copy. And this is at the expense of the real story behind what has happened. We'll hear, for instance, that Israeli soldiers have disproportionately shot or killed Palestinian youth or youths who are throwing stones at Israeli soldiers. I've been on the border. I've seen these stones. Very often these are boulders. They're huge missiles. These kids use slingshots. They're trained to kill. So I'm sure Israeli soldiers are not going to stand there and be picked off, but this is never reflected in the Israeli media. The other thing is never, in the British media, this is never, the other thing that's never reflected is the humanitarian side of Israel. This is left to the Jewish media to cover. For instance, Palestinian children from other neighboring countries being given life-saving operations free of charge in Israeli hospitals. The leader of Hamas's own child being saved with open heart surgery. And these people are petrified to let it be known in their own countries that Israel has even helped them. So the media generally tends to ignore this, and this is always left to ourselves to reflect. But often we will even see in some national media, not as much as it used to be, government sources in Israel being quoted from Tel Aviv. And this, I can't believe, is always an error, just a reporting error, that Tel Aviv is being cited as the capital of Israel. There seems to be a lot of difficulty among the media in this country to recognize Israel for what it is, the democracy that it is. And I think a lot of the journalists tend to swallow the hype that they are led to believe and don't report things accurately, always either on TV, radio, or in the print media.
Thanks, Paul. Jessica, what's your take on the treatment of Israel in the media?
I mean, it's not something I ever cover or really take. I can't say that I'm speaking from a huge position of knowledge here. I don't think it's something that I notice happening, but I'm sure people will be able to pick out examples. But frankly, I think the Middle East has arguably got less attention than it should have done in recent years. I'd mainly class Syria in that category as somewhere I feel like probably should have got more attention and more coverage. I mean, there are always going to be stories where those who tend to assume the worst about Israel are going to exploit them, such as the Beirut explosion. I thought that was some of the conclusions that were jumped to there were very telling. But frankly, I thought the generally negative coverage about things like the annexations plan or Netanyahu's choice for the UK ambassador were pretty fair criticism of things I thought were quite difficult and controversial. So, as someone who is fairly skeptical about the approaches of the current Netanyahu government, I don't find the coverage particularly unfair, although I'm sure there are examples that people could point me to.
Well, we promised we'd have different views on the panel, and we have, so thank you. Which brings me to Richard, your view on the portrayal of Israel in the media.
Routinely baffled by the priorities that the media put in place when it comes to coverage excuse me, of Israel and the Middle East. I mean, where do I start? From the good news that is always ignored in terms of areas, what Paul mentioned, humanitarian, high tech. Every time I go to Israel, I make sure I go to Technion or one of these incredible hives of creativity where they're making the smallest USB stick in the world, or a pill can that you can swallow, or a sniff phone that detects cancer. Or, I mean, if there's a cure for COVID or a flying car, you can be assured that it's currently being invented in Israel. So those sort of life-affirming things, I think, are too often ignored by the media, especially that they're coming from the Middle East, which, despots and dictators have called their own for centuries. That these inventions are suddenly coming from that area of the world is an absolute miracle for Western civilization. Jessica mentioned the lack of emphasis on other areas in the Middle East, Syria. She pointed to Yemen. I'd suggest is another. The plight of the Uyghur Muslims in China. Looking at Asia is an area that I think is being roundly ignored by the world media in favor of things that are going on currently in Israel. But, the Israeli government has never helped itself. They've never really been bothered, I don't think, by PR, by public opinion. Look at Tzipi Hoftalevi, the new UK ambassador that's going to be here in a number of weeks, the settlements minister, someone I would suggest is a rum choice for ambassador to the UK, but clearly Netanyahu doesn't care about these things and has more important priorities in place. To the casual observer, the Palestinian issue is a black and white issue. They're not interested in looking deeper than what they see as headlines. The plight of the Palestinians is used as a stick to beat diaspora communities, the British Jewish community particularly. Look back to Gaza 2014. It was a disaster for British Jews, wasn't it? Gaza 2014. It was horrific. Jews to the gas, and Hitler was right. Posters down Kensington High Street. I mean, it was chilling stuff. A lot of what happened in Gaza in 2014 to the moon, and allowed anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism to kind of blend as one and give anti-Semitic succor. So I think we could be helped a bit more when it comes to Israel and its disinterest when it comes to PR. But of course, there's so much that's so good about this tiny little plucky little democracy in the Middle East that's being ignored, and that breaks my heart.
Yeah, plucky, good description, thank you. Which actually neatly leads into the next area I want to go to, and it's a question that's come in. It's about editors and ideology. So warning for you, Richard, I'll come to you first. And the question that I've got here is, it sometimes appears as though Jewish newspapers come at issues from different ideological standpoints. How much is that to do with the views of the editor, and how much is it to do with the culture of the paper? So clearly, Richard, you're very well placed to answer that, as will be Paul And Jessica, you'll be able to sweep up very nicely on that.
Yeah, I mean, every decision in the paper, every choice of angle to take, quote to record, opinion writer to commission, picture to publish, it's all down to the editor's final decision. Now, if journalism gets a bad rap, but journalists are, and I'm not on the whiskey yet, the most ethical people I've worked with in terms of getting the story, not publishing he said without getting the she said, getting the balance, getting the story and making the reader decide for themselves what they think. Of course there's nuance, of course there's bias, of course there's perspective. In terms of philosophy, I mean, I'm a secular Jew. I'm not religious in any way, and I think that gives the Jewish news a broader perspective. As long as it's rational to the right or rational to the left, of course, I get the privilege to decide what rational is, then it has a place in the newspaper. An editor who's more orthodox, like a strictly orthodox editor, might not publish a picture of Laura Jana Klausner, the head of the Reform movement, because she happens to be the wrong gender. These are decisions that people make based, of course, on their worldview. I would argue, as I touched on at the top, it's so difficult to get people engaged in a product that has Jewish in the title that why would you make it even harder for yourself by stripping down the levels of the community that you want to engage? And there are so many issues, Gillian, that I think we need to engage with in the Jewish community. And the Board of Deputies will, of course, know this as well as or better than me. The shifting demographics from strictly Orthodox, from secular to strictly Orthodox, the communal intolerance between the left and the right, online extremism, how do we get, re-engage with the Labour Party, strengthening of Muslim-Jewish ties, which I think is massively important, firming up the legacy of our Holocaust survivors with the Westminster Memorial in the years to come as we finally lose our last survivors. There are so many issues that I think doesn't matter how religious or irreligious you are, that you feel them in the deepest pits of your heart, and you know that they're important to British Jewish life. So these are the things that motivate me. And whether you are a secular Jew like me, a twice a year, or a devout, strictly Orthodox person living in Stamford Hill, I want you to read the Jewish news.
I think we got the advert. Paul, Paul, you are an editor yourself. Tell us what you think about the influence of the ideology or otherwise of the editor.
I think what this question really means is the coverage in a particular newspaper balanced, or is it purely reflecting what the editor thinks? I think most newspapers, and certainly mine, I would say, is in my mold without any doubt at all. But I'm open to listening to the opinions of my staff, whether it's politically or religiously or in any other way. My younger staff will often say to me that this is a generational thing. If we want to run something you don't understand, and we have a debate about it, and sometimes I will agree that they're right. I will always listen. They'll tell me possibly we're wrong in highlighting something because this is what older people think and younger people don't, and that's fair enough. I would like to think that we're pretty balanced, and the two stories I'm going to tell you are not apocryphal. These are absolutely true. But on one particular Friday morning, I received a telephone call from somebody from Manchester Beth Din, accusing us, as we often are, of being anti-Orthodox, Haredi bashing. The paper had an anti-Orthodox line. The same morning, I received a call from the rabbi of Manchester's leading Reform synagogue telling me we were anti-Reform. So I knew we were doing something right then because the balance was obviously there. And there was another famous occasion I remember many years ago when I actually covered an event in Lytham St Anne's, and it was being addressed by Rabbi Menachem Porosh, who was then a member of the Knesset. And we ran headlines that week, what he had to say, that middle-class Israelis were struggling to buy food. On Friday morning that we ran that story, I received a telephone call from the head of UGIA in Manchester, I think it was the JIA in those days, accusing us of being anti-JIA, destroying their fundraising, how dare we run this, and they would boycott the paper. The same day, we received a phone call from somebody from the Jewish Agency, the Aliyah department, congratulating us. Sorry, it was the other way around. I should have said the Aliyah department criticized us, saying we were anti-Israeli, we were putting people off going to Israel, and the UGIA thanked us because this was helping with the fundraising. So when this sort of thing happens, you realize that to some extent you are being balanced, you're balancing it. But the editor has to make a decision, whatever happens. The Jewish Telegraph, throughout its 70 years, until 2 years ago, had always been apolitical. I have to say I'm an unusual animal because I'm apolitical. I don't necessarily vote for the same party at every election, and the paper reflects that as well. Until 2 years ago, this was the first time we took sides and urged our readers not to vote Labour. And I mean, leading up to the last election, we pleaded with readers, however good their local MP was, however good their local Labour candidate was, do not vote for him. And this did come from me, I have to say, and I've never taken that line before. And my staff agreed with me, and a lot of my staff were staunch Labour supporters and voted Labour all their lives. So, yeah, I think the paper is very much in the mould of an editor, but with balance.
Interesting. So, Jessica, perhaps from the world that you're in The Guardian, it'd be quite interesting to know about editors and their influence, but also your observations on the Jewish media.
I mean, I think that the editors clearly have a big role in shaping the drive of a newspaper. You know, news editors are very conscious of the kind of stories that they know that the editor wants to see us pursue, the kinds of things that the kinds of areas where we should be breaking stories, should be investigating, the kind of people that the editor's interested in. So that obviously drives some, you know, a lot of the coverage, but it also, I think that most editors, and I'm sure that Richard and Paul would agree, generally just want you to see you break good stories and get scoops and exclusives. I mean, that by and large has been my experience of editors, that like if it's a good story, and we can get it out there first, and it's going to affect things and change things, then it's important. Then that's what an editor wants to see.
Thank you. Let's move the conversation on to the question that I've just seen here that's come in about print media and the future or lack of it. And the question is, does print media have a future, or do you foresee a time when it's all online? And how do you react to that? Does it make you sad, or is it just progress? So I'll start with Paul this time, and then to Jessica and Richard.
Well, I don't think it's any secret that there's a move to electronic media. Younger people do seem to prefer to get their news online, free of charge if they can, rather than paying for conventional print media. I think particularly for the Jewish media, the Jewish print media, there is a future, certainly short-term, medium-term. I would like to think so. If our own circulation is anything to go by and the reaction we get, then there definitely is a future. And we seem to be retaining quite a lot of our younger readers, or winning them back. And we've got unashamedly gone out to do this. We only have to see the reaction on a Friday. If for some reason the paper has been late at a particular stockist or hasn't turned up, and people are almost in a panic. I run the risk of being a little bit sacrilegious when I say this, and it's a bit like the comment that John Lennon made many years ago when he said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, and there were public burnings of Beatles records, books, and other memorabilia. But I've often gone on record as saying that the Jewish Telegraph is as important in people's homes, or almost as important on people's homes on a Friday night as the Shabbos candles. And this does seem to be so. People literally get into a panic if they don't get the paper. So as long as people are feeling that way, then I'm happy to feel that we have a future. What's going to happen in 10 years' time, I don't know. Maybe very much smaller circulation, maybe our e-edition by then will be the principal method by which people receive their news. We were pleasantly surprised by the reaction to the e-edition, and did realize that a lot of people preferred to read their paper on a tablet or on their phone. I'm a traditionalist. I love the feel of newspapers. I like to flick over the pages. I like to tear a bit out if I want. I can't read well, I suppose I could read the tablet in the bath, but it's not quite as easy. Or if I want to read the tablet in bed, I can do that without disturbing anybody, which I can't do with a newspaper. There is something about newspapers and the feel of them, the look of them. I still love it when on a Sunday morning I receive all the Sunday papers and start flicking through the various sections. I can't pretend to read every last bit. I'm not interested in certain parts, but I find bits to pick out here, there, and everywhere, and I found them very good value. And I'd like to think that there is some future for the print media, for the medium-term future at least.
Jessica, how do you feel about this?
I think that at the moment, print remains quite profitable for national newspapers. So there is still, even though circulations are dropping, print sales still make a significant amount of money, particularly while it's still unclear about how to properly make money out of internet advertising. When if you're looking for car insurance, you're unlikely to click on an advert for car insurance on the Jewish News website. You're more likely to go to Google and type it there, and that's where I'd expect most companies think their advertising spend is most likely to be more efficient. Having said that, I think that the long-term shift is probably towards a totally online future for most media, and I think that if that's the case, then people are going to want more and better ways to curate the kind of news they read, rather than just be confronted with a whole website full of endless reams of stuff that they aren't as interested in. It's easier to kind of get a more rounded view flicking through a newspaper, arguably. There's problems that we're always going to face. The Guardian's always going to face, particularly the conflict between having a paywall and also wanting our stories to have as much impact as possible. You want them to be spread far and wide. You want them to be read across the world, and that's less likely if there's a paywall. So it's always a balance.
Thank you. And Richard, how are you seeing this move away from print media?
I just sort of touched on it in her earlier comment when she basically said good content is good content. Doesn't matter how it's disseminated. Readers want exclusive stories of national interest that shape policy in Westminster, influence campaigns. I want brand, the Jewish News brand, at the centre of Jewish life in Britain. My cat's meowing in the background, so ignore him.
Does the cat have a view on this question? Because if so, put the cat on.
Shut up.
It'll be the first cat we've had on a BoDCast.
Well, in that case, let me grab him. Oh, he's run off. Look, 20 odd years ago, I mentioned it at the beginning, I was one of the people that launched totallyjewish.com, which was this big, exciting, new, sexy product for online. And here I am today, the night before my 50th birthday. Not that I want happy birthdays or anything, but yes, tomorrow is a lamp.
You might get that.
And I'm back editing a product made on dead trees. So I think reports of the death of newspapers are greatly exaggerated. I actually have to congratulate Paul on creating a business model that funds itself. The Jewish Telegraph doesn't have any philanthropic funding, and I think he should get credit for that. But he and I benefit from the fact that the community needs to talk to each other. They love to talk to each other. They love the charities, like to speak to the charities. The Board of Deputies, the Jewish Leadership Council need to disseminate information, and the only way they're really going to do that is through the Jewish media to a great extent. But I'm constantly fixated on digital, and to achieve what we want to achieve, we need to run events, or at least we did before the pandemic. the Jewish Living Expo, Night of Heroes, the Simcha Show, the Jewish Schools Awards, political Q&As. We've done kids' fun days, Havdalah Live, that's a thrill. We do a weekly podcast now with up to 2,000 listeners. So we're always thinking about new ways to reinvent ourselves. We have a digital edition that goes out to 20,000 people every day. I think that we'll be the last to go. National newspapers that have no unique selling point beyond the fact, you've got, the man in the street can't tell really the difference between, the Express and the Mail, or the Telegraph and the Times. They do the same thing. Jewish newspapers are bespoke and unique, and they'll be the last to go when it comes to a core audience that they serve.
Okay, thank you for that. Which I think let's go now to I've got a question about the way in which Jews are depicted in the media. And so this is the question that's come in for us. Do you think that the national media all think that we walk around in black hats? Wherever there's a news item about the Jewish community, that's always the image that they show. So, and we've had some conversation this evening about the diversity of our community. So, Jessica, what would be your take on that question?
Well, I think that criticism's probably fair, isn't it? That is the picture that first comes to mind in the mind of a picture editor who doesn't know anything about the Jewish community and its diversity. I suspect we're not the only minority in this country to experience such stereotyping when it comes to the choices of picture editors. I suspect some of my friends who are Muslim would not like to be portrayed by a picture of a woman in a kind of full burqa as an image of the Muslim community. And generally, I think that's just the case of more of an education of people making those decisions, and they probably aren't meant maliciously. And all that we can really do is kind of raise objections when we see them.
Richard, depictions of Jews?
Of course, yeah. There's stereotyping in the media. It's a device, isn't it? It's a visual headline. You see a man with a black hat and payot in the street, and you're looking at a Jewish story. I mean, I had some upset people at Jewish Women's Aid saying that we shouldn't use the head clutcher image for domestic abuse, and it's quite right. It's lazy. Often in a high pressurized situation when you're dealing on deadline, you don't have time for nuance. People need to know what they're reading at a glance. So that's also very important. And unfortunately, when it comes to TV, a klezmer band is never far behind. And when it comes to a news story in a newspaper, you'll see a man with a black hat, which obviously won't define a reform or secular person, but in terms of a device, in terms of what the picture editor at The Guardian is thinking, I think unfortunately that's just simply the headline device, and it doesn't betray the story any more than putting an entire story into a succinct 4 headlines betrays the story in terms of the words. It's just unfortunately something that has to be done.
Paul?
I would agree. I mean, every time in Manchester, for instance, there was a story about the Jewish community, whatever it relates to, the TV cameras end up in the ultra-Orthodox area of Manchester, depicting Haredim with payers, with streimels, the women with their shaitels. It's always the same. So there is stereotyping with that. Obviously, it's graphic, I suppose. You have to understand there is no other way to depict the Jewish community. If they just depict the middle of the road community walking around without yarmulkes in any way, then it doesn't really show anything. But I'm more concerned about other stereotypes, not pictorial. You so often read a story about somebody, there's a report in the national press, or even more so in the local and regional newspapers, where they will actually refer to somebody's Jewish background unnecessarily, or they will say from a middle-class Jewish background, somebody living in a £1 million house I mean, I was quite concerned to see the reports in some of the national press about Emma Barnett's elevation to the presenter of Woman's Hour. Why it was necessary to say that she came from an Orthodox Manchester Jewish background, I'm not quite sure. I was taught in my earliest days of journalism that you do not report, you do not mention a person's religion in a news story unless it's actually germane or relevant to that story, and I don't believe that was. Had she been Catholic, had she been Protestant, would they have said she was from a middle-class Protestant background? I doubt it.
Yeah, I think that...
Go ahead, Richard.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's incongruous to the story. I don't know why they did that. I think a lot of this is to do with our own oversensitivity, though. We need the courage of our convictions a little more. Whenever there's a Jew in the media, I sense the shiver and the horror. That feeling of, I don't know about you. When I was at school, we had a code word for Jew. We called it wedge. Because we didn't want to say Jew out loud. Or I'm on the train. But I was on the train in Boston when I edited the Jewish newspaper in Boston, and people were saying Jewish on the train. And I was like, oh no, you can't say that. I'm kind of inculcated in this kind of this Jewish kind of this neurosis. In the States, Jewish culture is loud and proud and joyous. It's not in Europe for obvious reasons. You only have to go back to the last century for that. And we are seen as slightly more exotic, I think, than they are in the States. But I would love that feeling of self-confidence in Jewish British identity, the sort of thing that you get when you go to JW3 or go to one of these places where British Jewish life is, as Raymond Summerson says, loud and proud. I'd love a bit more of that and a bit less of the neuroses.
Well, obviously the media can help us or not, depending. So I wanted to go to a question that I've got about balance and whether you've all got it right or wrong at any point. So the question is that the Jewish community, as we know, has very diverse views. How do you get the right balance in your coverage? And of course, the key question, do you feel you've ever got it wrong? I'm going to ask for a volunteer to go first.
I've definitely got it wrong on occasion.
Not me. I've got nothing to say about that.
Yeah, I know. He's never got it wrong. You see, but Paul is straightforward.
We try to be balanced. We try to give coverage to every facet of the Jewish community: liberal, reform, Orthodox, Haredi. If they bother to read the paper, they claim they don't read the paper. Well, very often we get Haredi readers ringing on a Friday morning to say, I don't read your paper, but at the bottom of page 30-something, you've written such and such. So unless they've thumbed through it in their supermarket, they've obviously read it. I once made a mistake many years ago, probably about 15 years ago, where we ran a picture on the front page of, funny enough, it was the Haredim in Uman before Rosh Hashanah. And they were actually bathing in a lake. They had no clothes on, but you couldn't, obviously you couldn't see anything, but we received a terrific backlash to that. And it was a sort of Victor situation. It was an agency picture, and we should never have run it. So that was a mistake, and that was misunderstanding the sensitivity of the community. But as I said earlier, we get accused of being anti-Orthodox, we get accused of being anti-reform. I think somehow we must be getting the balance right. It's very difficult. We're a Jewish newspaper, and a Jewish newspaper covers all aspects of the community. We received huge backlash last week because we dared to report the story of the Haredim in Uman massing on the border despite being told to stay away. We were told we were being irresponsible running this, that we were anti-Haredi. We weren't. We were just reflecting the news. A few weeks ago, we reported a particular wedding party that was raided by police, an ultra-Orthodox wedding in Greater Manchester. I was accused by the host, who was one of our advertisers, of being a moiser, a traitor, because we reported the story. When I asked him why we were being traitor, he said we shouldn't be running these stories. I won't repeat the rest of the language, but it wasn't pleasant. That we shouldn't be alerting the police, despite the fact the police were there. So we're considered to be anti-orthodox. I said to him, are you saying that we shouldn't have run it because we're telling the truth? To which he didn't comment. 2 weeks ago, a local ultra-Orthodox supermarket in Manchester declined any further to stock the Jewish Telegraph. They said some of their customers don't like the stories we run about the Haredi community. And I said, well, what do you mean by this? You write stories they don't like. I said, you mean because we tell the truth? And the answer was yes. That's really what I've got to say on that.
Jessica, do you ever get it wrong at The Guardian?
Yeah, of course you feel like you might have misjudged stories all the time. I was trying to think about whether there's been a particularly one about the Jewish community where I feel like we didn't quite get the balance right. And I've been sort of racking my brains about someone. I'm sure that viewers will be able to bring that to bring one to my attention. But yeah, of course, there's things where just generally in reporting politics where you realise that you might have missed a key hint in what someone was telling you. You might have overemphasised something or been led one way by a source and realise that that's not quite the way that the government is planning to do something, and this is actually just lobbying on the part of your source rather than it being actually true. And so I think I've learned from being in Westminster how much you need to canvass a broad range of opinions before you ever commit something to writing, because people have very little motivation to tell you something unless they want you to use it in some way, and they don't tell you things for a favour. They do it because somehow it will benefit them or their cause, and so that, you make slip ups in that regard. You buy into someone's spin too much, and you make mistakes, but then it usually teaches you something.
Sure, that's very true. Richard, do you ever get it wrong?
Of course, get it wrong all the time. Not for want of trying to be perfect. Obviously, we're trying to report things that someone somewhere doesn't want you to report. Everything else is PR, as a famous journalism quote goes. So that's really what you're trying to do with every single story. And you get it wrong for many, many reasons. You get it wrong because you haven't developed a good off-the-record relationship with a source, perhaps. So you haven't been fully versed on the story, so you can make a rounder, better decision about something. Or simply you're trying to avoid being vanilla and you want to produce a story that's packaged and presented in a compelling way. One example recently was the George Floyd story on the front page, where we went with the headline, Derek Chauvin kneeled on us all, which makes me shudder now to think about it. But at the time, and I had conversations with colleagues that told me this was a bad thing to do, but no, I wouldn't listen. I wanted it to be like a je suis je solidarity, feeling that, racism when we're all in it together. But of course, got that completely wrong. The following week, we ran 4 brilliant Black Jewish people on the front page telling me what a dreadful decision I'd made, and it was a learning curve, and I learned from it. So yeah, there's many, many decisions. As long as it's all done with good intention, and you hold your hand up and you learn from it and you don't make the same mistake twice. I've never made the same mistake twice, which I think is something I'm quite proud of. There's lots of mistakes I'm not going to make along the way, but yes, as long as you do it with good intention and passion, and you come from a good place, I think that's all really anybody can ask of you.
I'm sure that everybody watching has appreciated the honesty with which you've all spoken of mistakes. And there's that saying about you keep making the same mistake until you learn from it. So if you only make it once, you clearly have learned. So that's a very interesting thing that we're hearing from you all. Don't ask me where the time has gone, but we are coming towards the end of our podcast. And so I've got one more brief question for you all. And after that, I'm going to ask you just to take a minute or so to summarise any thoughts from the discussion tonight. So the question, and if you could keep your answers succinct, is about other journalists. What journalists do you most enjoy reading and why? Jessica.
I'm just a really vociferous consumer of news, so it's hard for me to pick them out. I think in terms of, I never write comment journalism myself, and I try to steer really well clear of it. So I always admire brilliant comment writers, but I particularly admire those who can tell me something new rather than just commentating on what's happened in the day's news. And so those kind of people, I guess, are people like my colleague Raphael Baer, I guess Rachel Sylvester in the Times, definitely Stephen Bush in the New Statesman, Tom McTague in the Atlantic. These are fantastic political writers who always sort of reveal something new. In terms of writing on culture, I really love Nesrin Malik, who writes for The Observer. She just so particularly on the kind of cultural stuff, she is just really she really just cuts to the heart of pretty much anything that's being discussed that week. Who else do I think are good? I've probably named loads. I think
you have.
Yeah.
People are making notes. I know they are. Thank you. Richard, briefly, what journalists are you reading? Why?
Well, Jessica named a few there. Stephen Bush, I never miss anything he writes. I like the journalists that kind of deliver a kind of an iron hand in a velvet glove. People that really wallop you over the head with an opinion, but you don't realise you're being convinced until the end. I love Hugo Rifkind, wrote an amazing piece today on Lockdown 2. I'm sure some of you have read that. One of the best pieces I've read this week. I like Matthew Said in the Times, Rod Liddell in the Times. Don't always agree with him, but find him hilarious. Camilla Long, same with her. Oh God, who else? Jenny Fraser. I like Jenny Fraser in the Jewish News. She's always fantastic.
Love Jenny.
Yeah. And of course, Jessica Elgot and Paul Harris.
Oh, well, that was, I mean, I did assume that all the people on the screen were given.
Yeah. Goes without saying, Richard.
Clearly. And interesting, you both mentioned Stephen Bush, and I know you both know, but Stephen, we're very pleased to have as chair of the Board of Deputies Commission on racial inclusivity in the Jewish community. Is doing a tremendous job for us, really, very groundbreaking as an initiative, and the work he's doing is much appreciated. So, Paul, what journalists are you reading and why?
Well, I devour news voraciously, so I read a multitude of columnists, reporters, analysts. I like people like Danny Finkelstein, because he can write about politics, he can write incisively about sport. Nice column as well. Matthew Syed. I could name so many because I just enjoy reading. Quentin Letts, I find extremely amusing. And I enjoy particularly reading the work of my own journalists, particularly those who have trained, come up, and I suppose it's a cavil to read what they write and how well they can do it as they've progressed over the years.
Well, plenty of material there for us all to be reading, so thank you for the recommendations. I'm now going to come to you each in turn, just so if you could just take a minute or so to summarise any final thoughts that you might have. So let me start with Richard.
Well, I'm 50 tomorrow, so that's depressing. So I might write about that next week. Look, I think I touched on it during a previous question when I was talking about all the different things that I think a Jewish newspaper is kind of incumbent upon them to report at the moment, to make them compelling reading for Jewish people, whether they are, teenagers or retirees. We've got a lot of challenges ahead of us in terms of particularly, I think, the diaspora's relationship with Israel. I think it's endlessly fascinating. Online extremism is another big issue. The shifting demographics, which I spoke about earlier, I know is an issue close to the heart of Jewish policy research and the Board of Deputies. That's going to have absolutely emphatic influence on British Jewish life in the years to come. An issue close to my heart is that, as another issue I mentioned, which is the legacy of the Holocaust survivors as we lose our final few. Lots of different issues I want to put front and centre of the Jewish news, both in print and online in the months to come. And I hope that the Jewish news can go from strength to strength, and we're having the conversation about whether there's a future for print media in 10, 20 and 30 years' time.
That will be interesting if we are. Paul, a minute or so, your reflections on the debate and discussions and issues tonight.
I think one of the things the community has to remember is that the Jewish press, whilst it serves the community, is not servile or a servant to the Jewish community. So many organisations feel that they have a right to space within the paper and demand space very often, and I'm sure other sections of the Jewish media find exactly the same. And I think the other thing that Jewish organisations need to understand is that those which can afford to advertise should be supporting us and not expecting all the time free publicity. So much material we receive is just nothing but puffery and PR material, but we get demands that this should appear, and this is very often in lieu of advertising. And I think this is going to be very important for the Jewish media, that we are supported as much as possible by those Jewish organisations which can afford to advertise with us. There is a future for the Jewish media. I think we've seen that tonight and heard it tonight. We're all very, very different in our approaches and the communities we cover. One of the things that I'm most aware of is that with the Jewish Telegraph, we are very often the only link some people have with the Jewish community. They don't belong to organisations, they don't belong to synagogues, they have no contact with the community other than the Telegraph. And we realise that this responsibility weighs very heavily upon us.
Thank you, Paul. And the last minute goes to Jessica.
Phil, I want to use this last minute to talk as maybe less as a journalist, more of a kind of consumer of Jewish news from the outside, and just to say something about how much how a kind of renewed connection with the community has come through for me, particularly during lockdown and having had a baby during that period. It has been, I think, seeing the kind of huge efforts of shuls to look after the vulnerable, to see how our community particularly has been hit by COVID very badly, and probably because of there is such a closeness within the community, such close families, such large gatherings. That first Friday night of the full lockdown, when there was where our shul was broadcasting on Zoom, and suddenly you saw 200, I think almost 300 people logging into a Friday night service. Always, our rabbi seemed to have a tear in his eye, could barely get the words out through emotion. And this community means a great deal to people that goes way beyond kind of fights about language used about Israel or the future of the Labour Party. And what I love about the Jewish media that I read is when that we can kind of bring out that aspect of the community.
I think that's the point.
I know Jessica was going to have the last word. She just reminded me. I did want to just say.
Can't resist. It'll have to be such a brief last word, Richard.
Say that one of the great things, if I can use the word great, that we've done in the last few months is pay tribute and tell the stories of great people in the community that sadly have passed through COVID. People like Avram Pinter and Neil Croft and Uri Ashkenazi and Osher Westheim. These people have we've lost, and we've been able to tell their stories, and that's been a real privilege.
And the point that Jessica made, which you've amplified, that I think is so important, that's come through tonight, is how the Jewish media is so much of our Jewish community. The two are so interlinked and they strengthen each other. And so I want to say thank you to Paul Harris from the Jewish Telegraph, Richard Ferret from the Jewish News, Jessica Elgot from The Guardian, for your time, for your energy, for all that you do within the media and within the community for all of us, whether members of the Jewish community or not, because everyone's listening to what you've got to say. You're in an important position, and we wish you all strength. And the very final wish, of course, is to Richard, to wish him a very happy 50th birthday.
Happy birthday.
How did you know?
Birthday. Because you've told me at least twice. But thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the viewers tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and have learnt as much as I have. It's been tremendous. So thank you, Paul, Jessica, Richard, and to everybody, have a good evening.